if I'd be speaking to this bill, and if so, what I would be saying. And I said in essence that I would be saying the same things that I've said at earlier readings. And frankly, having heard the member who introduced this bill, I think I could have been quite justified in simply rereading a speech from a former reading of this bill, because I'm quite sure that that's what the gentleman did in his initial speech. We heard the same old cliches. We heard about the opposition to this bill coming from Chardonnay socialists, from people who dwell in ivory towers, exactly the same language from all of the members' earlier speeches. We heard him once again failing to persuade anybody that all imprisoned, all prisoners are guilty of serious offences, which immediately puts that member at odds with the analysis of the Attorney-General, in whose report we see the word irrational appearing a number of times in relation to this bill. The Attorney-General, of course, found this bill unjustifiably inconsistent with the Bill of Rights, and the word irrational popped up. He said, the Attorney-General said that the objective of the bill is not rationally linked to the blanket ban on prisoner voting, and made the point that fine defaulters, for example, who most people would not deem to be serious offenders, would nevertheless be caught up in a 3-month sentence, would lose the right to vote. The Attorney-General pointed out that the bill would introduce irrational inconsistencies in the law, where it's possible for a mentally impaired prisoner detained in a hospital or a secure facility for less than 3 years can continue to vote, while all prisoners serving sentences less than 3 years would be disenfranchised. And I ask, where is the logic in that? The Attorney-General again says the blanket ban on prisoner voting is both under and over-exclusive. People convicted and sentenced for 2.5 years will lose the right to vote. Someone convicted for 3 years that happens to straddle, 3-month period that happens to straddle an election would lose the right to vote. The point is made again by the Attorney-General. The irrational effects of the bill also cause it to be disproportionate in its objective. That is quite strong, severe language coming from the Attorney-General, who is generally a relatively moderately spoken person. But it does cut to the nub. This is a wholly irrational piece of legislation. It has no value. It wastes the time of this House even to be debating it at a time when we do have a crisis in corrections in this country. This bill is a misguided attempt to appeal to the perceived populist groundswell, the short-sighted view that locking up people for longer and giving them more punishment in prison is somehow a desirable thing. There is no evidence that there is a popular groundswell or a popular belief in that perception. All of the evidence is that people will and do support solutions that make our society safer, that keep people out of prison, that reduce crime and recidivism. And despite the nonsensical extremism of vocal pro-prison groups like the Sensible Sentencing Trust, who it seems is more interested in manipulating the victims of crimes, perpetuating their grief and their anger, rather than taking positive actions to try and heal that anger or to relieve some of that grief, in the interest of continuing to fuel this falsehood that in fact New Zealanders are calling for longer and tougher sentences. We are wasting our time with this nonsense bill that not even its author can make a sound and rational argument for, at a time when, despite a steadily declining crime rate, reporting of crime is increasing and therefore feeding the perception that in fact we are in a worse state than we are. We've recently heard bragging from the government that they have doubled the number of places available for prisoners to receive treatment for drug and alcohol rehabilitation. We will now treat perhaps 1,000 people rather than 500 per year. We know that the real need is something like 6 or 7 times that number. And while we continue to spend 70% of the $1.2 billion a year on keeping people locked away inside concrete steel jungles, and spend about 12 cents in the dollar on practices that would actually serve to reduce their offending and to break that cycle of reoffending, we are doomed to be on the same track. We know from the 2010 National Health Committee report that almost 9 out of 10 inmates have substance abuse issues. Over half of the prison population have psychotic, mood or anxiety disorders. A handful of these can expect to get any mental health treatment while they are in the prison. Perhaps 1 in 20 will receive any treatment for their mental health issues. And instead of dealing with these very real and very treatable problems, we are dealing with nonsense like this supposed solution that will not reduce crime, it will not serve the interests of one offender, it will not make anybody in society safer or make them feel safer. While the failed corrections policies of this and previous governments are burning up huge amounts of money, destroying social cohesion and reducing human potential, there is nothing in this bill that will do any positive good. A vote for this bill is a vote for pursuing failed policies. It is a vote for looking back to a 19th century mindset. Instead of doing real work in this House, assigning some of that $1.2 billion to positive solutions, that work is actually being left to the volunteer sector, the community sector, those organisations, those volunteers who know what the solutions are, as do many of us in this House, and who are applying those situations. And I was privileged to be in Ruakaka recently at an event where I met a gentleman, a former gang member, who's done his time in jail, and he has come out the other side, and he understands that his role from here for the rest of his life is to try and stop other people offending, to keep others out of jail, to heal those who are unwell and who are committing crimes. I saw a man stand and very near come to tears in admitting that he had been guilty of violence against his family, that he had abused them verbally, that he intimidated his family. And that man is now turned around and will not reoffend because he has been involved in a community-based program driven and led by volunteers. And it is to the shame of this House and to the people who perpetuate this sort of policy nonsense that we are not supporting, that we are not contributing more to those real community-based solutions, which in the longer term are the only solutions which are going to contribute to breaking the cycle of offending and reoffending and removing the stain on our nation's pride. The fact that we are the second highest in terms of incarcerating people in the developed world. It's one place we've not only caught up with Australia, we've exceeded Australia, despite some people's fondness for referring to Australia's background in the history of the settlement of that country. We are in a crisis in terms of corrections. We are in a financial crisis. We're spending $1.2 billion a year, and it will soon become the single largest cost on the public purse. There is a cultural crisis. More and more people are being confused and frightened by believing that in fact crime is increasing when in fact it is not. We have a crisis in this government policy, a failure of imagination, a failure of thinking, an unwillingness to accept and adopt real solutions. In preference, they would rather offer us this sort of meaningless policy, this meaningless bill without any substance, which will do no one any good, and we will continue to oppose it. Kia ora.